Berg, and welcome to another edition of Collection Reflection. And today we're reflecting on Zachary Taylor, the only U.S. president we can claim as being a Kentuckian, really. Lincoln, we know, was born here but moved away and was associated with Illinois. But Zachary Taylor was born in Virginia but moved here when he was 1 year old. And was raised here in the Louisville area, outside the family farm Springfield, there along 42 Brownsboro Road, where Zachary Taylor National Cemetery is now. And Springfield, the family house, still stands. It's a private residence. So Taylor was raised here in the Louisville area. He joins the Army in 1808. He rises through the ranks. He acquits himself very well in the War of 1812. He is a veteran and a colonel in the Black Hawk War of 1832, the Second Seminole War down in Florida a few years later in the 1830s. And by the time the 1840s roll around, he is one of the highest ranking officers in the Army, which is really quite small at that time. And in 1847, he rises to great national prominence as one of the heroes of the Mexican War, or the Mexican-American War, as it is sometimes referred to now. With victories at Palo Alto, Reseca de la Palma, Monterey, and of course the really big victory in February of 1847 against Santa Anna and his Mexican troops. Santa Anna, of course, of Alamo infamy, in 1836, when all the defenders of the Alamo, Davy Crockett among them, were wiped out. He defeats Santa Anna's forces, a much larger force, and is a national hero. And here you can see in this Courier print, it's not Courier and Ives yet, it's just Nathaniel Courier now, and this print from 1847 depicting him as, and it says rough and ready. And that's the nickname he had, was Old Rough and Ready, because he looked pretty rough and he always seemed to be ready. He fooled many a young officer who would come to camp. He didn't stand a lot on military etiquette and protocol and dress uniforms and things like that. He often just kind of wore old civilian clothes and an old floppy hat. And many a young officer was fooled in meeting this, who they thought was an old farmer in camp when they report for duty, and then to find out that he was their commanding officer. So he didn't stand a lot on that kind of etiquette and military protocol, but he was a good leader, he was an inspiring leader, and of course, what happens when you're a military hero? It happened with Washington, it happened with Jackson, it happened with William Henry Harrison, and one of your political parties is going to want to tab you as their standard bearer. And that is what the Whigs managed to do in 1848. He is elected on the Whig ticket as president. It is a close election, but he comes in with essentially zero political experience. And he kind of alienates and upsets the Whigs who helped get him elected. The Democrats, he's rather apolitical. I think he confessed at one point that he had never even voted in a presidential election, maybe even an election, because he was a pure military man. But he rises to the presidency, but it's rather short-lived. On July 4th, 1850, he makes the mistake of attending on a very hot day a ceremony for the laying of the cornerstone for the Washington Monument. He drinks chilled milk and eats fresh fruit. Cherries and strawberries have been specifically mentioned. And he comes down with what at that time was called cholera morbus. We know it as a severe case of gastroenteritis. And of course, in that day, medical science being what it was, doctors did certain things. And the cure or the treatment was sometimes worse than the ailment. And in this case, they bled him, they purged him, and they blistered him. And essentially, if they didn't kill him, they certainly hastened his death. but that was the standard treatment. And so he dies in office and is buried temporarily there in the D.C. area and eventually brought back and buried on the family farm in the Taylor Cemetery, Taylor Family Cemetery, where today the Zachary Taylor National Cemetery is, there along 42 and Brownsboro Road. There's a nice mausoleum there to him, a crypt for he and his wife, and there's a very nice monument. So if you're ever out in that area and you want to drive back and see it, that's great. Now, as many things go, fiction and fact can get kind of blurred. And in 1991, a novelist floated the theory that he'd been assassinated in 1850, that he'd been poisoned with arsenic. The guilty parties, as bizarre as this may seem to even begin to believe, were Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John C. Calhoun. Depending upon your politics, you might believe that one or all three of those men were capable of that. But on the basis of this theory, the family descendants of Taylor, still around, agreed to have the body exhumed. It was an absolute media madhouse here in Louisville regarding this. It was all over C-SPAN and CNN and everything else. The national media was all over this. The body's exhumed. They take it in to essentially perform an autopsy, really to take samples and to test them for poisoning. And lo and behold, no surprise, he was not poisoned. Everything was natural in the levels that should have been. And so he did indeed die of natural causes, helped along by the doctors. Now, before we move and talk a little bit more about this wonderful portrait that James Reid Lambdin painted of Taylor for the 1848 campaign, presidential campaign, we have a number of Zachary Taylor letters and documents in our collection. And this is a letter he wrote, and he served on the frontier for many years. This is written from Fort Crawford up in the Prairie du Chien, which of course is today up along the Mississippi, upper Mississippi in Wisconsin. It was a Michigan territory then, in 1829. So he was all up and down the Mississippi at various postings. He had a plantation down in the Mississippi, Louisiana area near St. Francisville, Louisiana. But he really considered himself a Kentuckian, and hence why he was buried back in Kentucky. But if you look at this first page, he had a very strong hand. He pressed hard. But this is one, as I turn the page, you're going to see something that absolutely makes historians and many collectors and certainly lovers of history absolutely cringe. And that is something called autograph collecting. And I'm going to hold it up. This is like, and you can play peekaboo, with it. And you can see, this was natural. Somebody probably years ago tore that out to write a note or something on this blank piece of paper. But look at this. Look at this. And so wherever Taylor appeared, it would have been his signature here of Zachary Taylor, or Z Taylor, as he usually signed his name. But up here, he wrote Taylor, they clipped it. And over here, Taylor, and they clipped it. And that's what there you see on the back there. They would have, as he wrote Taylor there, because he's writing his brother Hancock Taylor, who lived here in Jefferson County. And so somebody, before they really didn't think about it, and we've seen this in letters and actual correspondence where autograph collectors are writing descendants, family members, and others who have letters of Taylor and Lincoln and Washington and whomever, and say, can you send me a signature? Can you send me a letter? And they say, oh, sure. And they go in and they simply clip or send a whole letter or something like that. We sometimes benefit because of it, but often the letter itself is essentially in many ways mutilated. So that's really a shame that happens, but at least the content of the letter is preserved and available to researchers. Now back to the portrait itself, is a very fine portrait. Again, I have a lot of favorites in the collection, and this is one of my favorites. It shows old Rough and Ready looking much more refined and distinguished than his appearance would have been out in the field. This was painted by James Reid Lambdin. Now, Lambdin is heavily associated with Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. He was born in Pittsburgh in 1803. He apprenticed as a sign painter and a wood carver. He took up the study of art. He studied briefly under Thomas Sully in Philadelphia in the 1820s. And then in 1832, Lambdin comes to Louisville. And he started in Pittsburgh in 1827. He had started a museum, kind of like Charles Willson Peale's Museum of Natural History and kind of everything in Philadelphia. Well, he had been inspired probably when he was studying with Sully in Philadelphia, and he had started a museum in Pittsburgh and then decided maybe the West was a good place to have it. Maybe it'd be more profitable here. I don't know for sure. But in 1832, he comes to Louisville. He establishes his Louisville Museum. And of course, while he's operating the museum, he is also painting. And we have a wonderful portrait of Edward Dorsey Hobbs painted during his Louisville sojourn. He also, as many others like Jewett and Bush and others would do, he'd winter down south in Natchez and in his case Mobile, New Orleans, and in that area in the deep south, and then come north again in the summer. Eventually, I guess the museum wasn't as profitable as he would have hoped, and he moves in 1837, he moves to Philadelphia. And there he spends the rest of his career. He has the distinction of painting every president from John Quincy Adams in the 1820s to James Garfield in the 1880s. So that's quite a stretch, over 50 years in which he painted every U.S. president from life. He eventually, as an educator and as an artist in Philadelphia, lived a good long life and passed away. But his Louisville sojourn, we're very happy because we're still actually finding things out about it still today. And of course, his wonderful, certainly done as the hero of Buena Vista, old Rough and Ready, and as a presidential candidate, we have this very, very fine portrait of Kentuckian and General and President Zachary Taylor. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Collection Reflection, and I hope you'll join us again.